I knew something was wrong the moment my son said the restaurant had changed. "Trust me, Mom," Daniel told me that afternoon, smiling the same polite smile he used when he didn't want questions. "You're going to love this place." It was my 72nd birthday, and I had spent the morning quietly excited in the small brick house where I had lived for almost 40 years. I even wore the blue cardigan Daniel gave me 2 Christmases ago, the one he said made my eyes look brighter. When he pulled his car into the driveway, I believed we were heading to dinner, maybe that steakhouse downtown where he used to take me after my husband passed. Instead, we drove across town in silence. I watched the streets change through the passenger window. The shops disappeared. The houses grew older. Eventually, we turned onto a quiet road lined with tall maple trees and a sign that read Greenwood Nursing Home. I thought perhaps we were visiting someone. Maybe a friend of his. Maybe a volunteer event. Daniel parked the car, but didn't turn off the engine right away. His hand stayed on the steering wheel longer than usual. Then he finally looked at me. His voice sounded careful, almost rehearsed. "Mom, this is where you'll be living from now on." For a moment I honestly believed I had misunderstood him. "Living?" I asked softly. "Just for a little while?" Daniel shook his head once. "It's better this way. The house was getting too hard for you to manage, and Ashley and I have been talking. This place has staff, meals, medical support. You'll be safer here." The words hung in the air between us. Safer. As if the home where I raised him had suddenly become dangerous. I noticed a small suitcase in the back seat that I didn't remember packing. Daniel stepped out of the car and opened the trunk. Inside were 2 more bags I had never seen before. My clothes. My things. Already packed. That was when I realized this wasn't a discussion. It was a decision that had already been made somewhere far away from me. A nurse came out through the glass doors with a clipboard and a practiced smile. Daniel carried the bags to the entrance while I slowly followed behind him, trying to understand how my birthday dinner had somehow turned into this moment. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old magazines. Someone had hung a paper banner that read Happy Spring above the reception desk. Daniel set my suitcase beside a chair and glanced at his watch. "They'll get you settled," he said. "I have to get back to work." I searched his face for something familiar, some trace of the boy who used to run into my arms after Little League games, but all I saw was polite impatience. "Daniel," I said quietly, "it's my birthday." He hesitated for half a second, then nodded as if remembering a small appointment he had nearly forgotten. "Right. Happy birthday, Mom." Then he turned, walked through the sliding doors, and drove away. I stood there in the lobby of Greenwood Nursing Home holding my purse, listening to the sound of his car disappear down the road, and that was how my 72nd birthday truly began. I did not cry after Daniel left. That surprised me more than anything. I had always imagined that a moment like that would break me completely, but instead I felt something quieter settle over my shoulders, something heavy and still, like the silence that comes after a long storm. The receptionist asked for my name and guided me down a hallway with soft beige carpet and framed pictures of flowers that looked the same every few steps. The building was warm, almost too warm, and somewhere down the corridor a television played an old game show with the volume turned higher than necessary. My room was at the end of the hall. It was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a wooden dresser, and a single window that faced the parking lot. From there I could see the same maple trees that lined the road where Daniel had driven away. The nurse placed my suitcase beside the bed and told me dinner would be served at 5:30 sharp in the dining room. She spoke gently, the way people do when they assume you are fragile. After she left, the room became very quiet. I opened one of the suitcases slowly and saw that someone had packed it with careful efficiency. My sweaters were folded. My photographs were stacked in an envelope. Even the blue cardigan I had worn earlier that day had somehow found its way inside. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room, trying to understand how a life could be reduced to 2 suitcases and a small dresser drawer. Outside the window, a man in a maintenance uniform was sweeping the sidewalk. A woman with silver hair walked past using a metal walker, moving slowly but steadily across the pavement. Everything looked ordinary, almost peaceful, yet something inside me kept repeating the same quiet thought. This had been planned long before my birthday arrived. Later that evening, I followed the sound of dishes into the dining room. About 20 residents sat at round tables, while a pair of attendants carried trays from the kitchen. The room smelled like mashed potatoes and baked chicken. A woman about my age sat across from me and introduced herself as Eleanor Brooks. She had bright gray eyes and a voice that carried a hint of humor even when she was not smiling. She asked how long I had been there. I told her the truth. Less than 3 hours. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if that explained more than I had actually said. During dinner, she talked about the garden behind the building and the way the staff allowed residents to sit outside during warm afternoons. I listened politely, but my attention kept drifting back to the empty chair beside the window. I wondered what Daniel and Ashley were doing at that exact moment. Perhaps they were eating dinner together in the house where I had spent most of my life. Perhaps they had already rearranged the furniture or changed the locks or begun discussing what to do with the spare bedroom that used to be mine. After dinner, I returned to my room and stood by the window again. The parking lot lights had turned on, casting pale yellow circles across the pavement. Somewhere far away a car passed along the road, its headlights briefly lighting the branches of the maple trees. I watched those lights fade into the distance and realized something that made the silence even heavier. No one had called to ask if I had settled in. No one had asked if I was comfortable. My birthday had ended without a single candle or a single card, and the only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of a wall clock above the door. The next morning arrived quietly, as if the world outside Greenwood Nursing Home had decided nothing unusual had happened the day before. Sunlight slipped through the narrow window beside my bed and rested across the floor in a pale square of gold. For a few seconds I lay still, listening to the distant sound of dishes clinking somewhere down the hallway. It took my mind a moment to remember where I was. Then the memory returned, calm and sharp. Daniel, the car, the lobby, the 2 suitcases beside the bed. I sat up slowly and folded the blanket the way I had done every morning for most of my adult life. Old habits do not disappear simply because the room changes. After washing up in the small bathroom, I walked down the hall toward the dining room where breakfast was being served. The smell of coffee filled the air, strong and familiar. Several residents were already seated at the round tables, speaking in quiet voices about the weather and the morning news. Eleanor Brooks waved me over to the chair beside her with the confidence of someone who had lived here long enough to understand every corner of the building. She greeted me with a small smile and asked if I had slept well. I told her the truth. Sleep had come in pieces, never staying long enough to feel restful. Eleanor nodded as if that answer was common here. During breakfast, she spoke about the daily routine of the place. Breakfast at 7:30, activities at 10, lunch at noon. She explained it in the calm tone of someone describing the schedule of a small town where every day moves at the same steady pace. While she talked, I stirred the oatmeal in my bowl and noticed something else settling quietly in my mind. Small details from the past few months began to line up like puzzle pieces I had not wanted to see before. Daniel had visited less often this year. When he did come by, Ashley usually remained in the car or checked her phone during dinner. A few weeks ago, Daniel had insisted on helping me organize my financial paperwork. He said it would make things easier in case of emergencies. At the time, I believed him. Now that memory felt different. Too careful. Too prepared. Even the conversation about the house had seemed harmless when he first mentioned it. He said the maintenance was becoming too much for someone my age. He said perhaps selling the property would simplify my life. I had trusted him because he was my son, the same boy who once built a crooked birdhouse in our backyard and proudly presented it to me like a treasure. Sitting there in the dining room of Greenwood Nursing Home, I finally allowed myself to consider a thought I had avoided since yesterday afternoon. Perhaps the move had never been about my comfort. Perhaps the plan had been unfolding for months while I continued believing everything was normal. Eleanor must have noticed the change in my expression because she set down her coffee cup and looked at me with quiet understanding. She did not ask any direct questions. Instead, she said something simple that lingered in the air long after the words left her mouth. She said that sometimes the truth reveals itself slowly, not in loud moments, but in the quiet spaces between ordinary days. I finished my breakfast without speaking much after that. Later, as I walked back down the hallway toward my room, the building felt less unfamiliar than it had the night before. The beige carpet, the framed flowers, even the distant television all seemed like parts of a place that had been waiting for me long before I arrived. Yet one thought continued to move quietly through my mind with increasing clarity. If Daniel had planned this carefully, then somewhere outside these walls a new chapter of my life had already begun without me. The only question that remained was whether I would continue living the story he had written or begin writing one of my own. I spent most of that afternoon sitting beside the narrow window in my room, watching the parking lot the way people watch the ocean when they are trying to understand something too large for words. Cars arrived slowly, one after another, each carrying someone who belonged here now. A daughter helping her father from the passenger seat. A husband carefully lifting a wheelchair from the trunk. Life continued in small, quiet motions outside the glass while my mind drifted backward through years I had not examined closely in a long time. Raising Daniel had never been easy, but it had always felt worthwhile. When his father passed away suddenly 26 years ago, the house felt much larger and much emptier at the same time. Daniel was 16 then, tall and quiet, and trying very hard not to show how frightened he felt about the future. I remember standing in the kitchen that first winter after the funeral, staring at a stack of unpaid bills, and wondering how one person could possibly hold a family together alone. I took 2 jobs that year. During the day, I worked at the county records office, organizing files and answering phones. In the evenings, I helped manage inventory at a small hardware store 3 miles from our house. The hours were long, but every Friday, I still managed to drive Daniel to baseball practice because he loved the game more than anything. I can still picture the dusty field behind the high school and the way the sun dropped slowly behind the bleachers while the boys practiced their swings. Daniel always looked toward the stands after each play to make sure I was still there. Sometimes I was the only parent watching, but he never seemed to mind as long as he could see me sitting on the same wooden bench with a paper cup of coffee in my hands. College came faster than I expected. Daniel had the grades, but not the money, and I remember the quiet evening when he told me he might postpone school for a few years to work instead. I told him that was not going to happen. The next week, I sold the small diamond ring his father had given me on our 10th anniversary. It was not worth a fortune, but it covered the first semester of tuition at the state university 40 miles away. When Daniel realized what I had done, he tried to argue with me, but I reminded him that opportunities do not wait forever. Watching him drive away that first morning of college classes was one of the proudest moments of my life. I believed then that the sacrifices of those difficult years had built something strong between us, something permanent. Even after he married Ashley and moved across town, I continued believing that bond would remain untouched by time or distance. Sitting beside the window at Greenwood Nursing Home, those memories felt both warm and painfully distant, like photographs from another lifetime. The boy who once promised he would always look after me had grown into a man capable of leaving 2 suitcases beside a bed and driving away without looking back. The realization did not arrive with anger or bitterness. It arrived quietly, like the fading light in the parking lot outside my window, bringing with it the understanding that sometimes the people we raise with love become strangers long before we notice the change. I began to notice that time moved differently inside Greenwood Nursing Home. Days were measured not by appointments or errands, but by the quiet rhythm of meals, medication carts, and the sound of the afternoon television drifting down the hallway. At 10 o'clock each morning, there was a small gathering in the lounge where residents drank coffee and read newspapers that were already a day old. Eleanor Brooks usually sat in the same chair near the window, her hands wrapped around a mug, as if she had been waiting there for years. A few days after I arrived, I joined her again in that lounge. She studied me with calm curiosity, the way people do when they understand something about you that you have not yet said aloud. We spoke about ordinary things at first. The weather, the garden behind the building where residents sometimes walked in the late afternoon, the staff member who played old jazz records during lunch on Fridays. Yet beneath the polite conversation, I felt Eleanor observing me carefully, as though she recognized the quiet shift happening behind my eyes. Finally, she asked a question that was gentle but direct. She asked how long my son had been planning my arrival here. I almost told her it had been sudden, something that happened in a single afternoon. But the words stopped halfway to my mouth, because the truth was slowly becoming clearer every day. I thought about the paperwork Daniel insisted on organizing 2 months earlier. He said it would protect me if anything unexpected happened. I thought about the conversation about selling the house, how Ashley nodded eagerly beside him, while explaining how modern apartments required less upkeep. At the time, their concerns sounded practical, responsible even. Now the memory felt different, like a script rehearsed too many times. Eleanor listened without interrupting as I shared a few of these memories. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together calmly. She told me something that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. She said that families rarely make sudden decisions about places like this. According to her experience, those decisions begin quietly months earlier in living rooms and kitchens, while the person most affected by them is still being told everything is fine. I did not feel anger when she said it. Instead, I felt something colder and clearer settle into place inside my mind. That afternoon, I walked through the small garden behind the building. The path curved gently around a patch of flowers that volunteers had planted near a wooden bench. A warm breeze moved through the trees, carrying the soft smell of fresh grass. For the first time since arriving, I realized that Daniel had not called. Not once. For days had passed, and the silence between us had grown large enough to fill the entire distance between Greenwood and the house where I used to live. As I sat on the bench, watching the sunlight move slowly across the lawn, another thought appeared quietly beside that silence. If Daniel and Ashley had truly believed this decision was best for me, they would have checked on me by now. They would have asked whether I was comfortable, whether the room was warm enough at night, whether the food tasted familiar. Instead, there had been nothing. Not a message, not a visit, not even a brief phone call. In that moment, I understood something Eleanor had not needed to explain directly. Sometimes the absence of someone tells you more than their words ever could. And as I sat there in the quiet garden, listening to the leaves move gently in the afternoon wind, I began to accept a truth that felt both painful and strangely peaceful. The life I had known for decades had already closed behind me, and somewhere ahead another chapter was slowly preparing to begin. I woke early on the 6th morning, before the breakfast carts began rolling down the hallway, and before the soft hum of conversation filled the lounge. The sky outside my window was still pale gray, the kind of quiet dawn that makes the world feel as if it is holding its breath. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee from the small machine near the nurse's station and watched the parking lot slowly come to life. A delivery truck arrived first, followed by a nurse pulling into the far corner space she used every morning. Life at Greenwood followed patterns that revealed themselves little by little, and after a few days I had begun to notice them all. Yet that morning something else lingered quietly in my mind. I had decided to walk beyond the garden path that afternoon, something Eleanor had mentioned was possible if I signed out at the front desk. Just beyond the property line, there was a small convenience store with a faded blue sign that read Cedar Market. Residents sometimes walked there for newspapers or small snacks. After lunch, I signed my name on the clipboard and followed the sidewalk that curved past the maple trees toward the road. The air smelled like warm asphalt and fresh-cut grass, a simple combination that reminded me of summer afternoons long ago. The market was no larger than a gas station shop, with 2 narrow aisles and a humming refrigerator filled with bottled drinks. A young clerk stood behind the counter reading a magazine, while country music played quietly from a small radio. I wandered slowly through the aisles, not really needing anything, but enjoying the simple freedom of leaving the building for a while. Near the counter was a display of brightly colored lottery tickets, each promising impossible fortunes printed in bold numbers. I had never been someone who believed in luck. My life had always been built on work and patience rather than chance. Yet that afternoon, something about the quiet randomness of the moment felt strangely comforting. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight fell through the glass door, or the way the store smelled faintly of coffee and cardboard boxes. Without thinking too much about it, I picked up a single ticket from the display. The price was only a few dollars, less than what I used to spend on a cup of coffee downtown years ago. The clerk rang it up without much interest and slid the small slip of paper across the counter. As I stepped back outside onto the sidewalk, the ticket rested lightly between my fingers. I almost laughed at myself for buying it. The idea of sudden fortune felt like something that belonged in television commercials, not in the quiet life of a 72-year-old woman adjusting to a new room at Greenwood Nursing Home. Still, I folded the ticket carefully and placed it inside my purse before beginning the short walk back along the tree-lined path. When I reached the garden behind the building, Eleanor was already sitting on the wooden bench, enjoying the late afternoon sun the way she did every day. She asked what I had bought at the market, and I showed her the ticket with a small shrug. She smiled in a way that suggested she understood more about hope than most people did. I slipped the ticket into the drawer beside my bed that evening and thought nothing more about it. To me, it was just a small distraction, a quiet moment of curiosity during an ordinary walk beyond the garden. I did not know that within a week that thin piece of paper would begin to change the direction of everything that came next. Nearly a week passed before I thought about the ticket again. Life inside Greenwood had already begun to settle into its quiet rhythm. Mornings started with the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway and the soft rattle of breakfast trays being pushed from room to room. Afternoons belonged to the garden where the sunlight warmed the wooden bench and the maple leaves moved slowly above our heads. I had begun to recognize the small routines that shaped the days there. Eleanor liked to sit near the rose bushes after lunch, and the nurse named Carla always hummed the same old song while delivering medication in the evening. The world had grown smaller but also strangely calmer, as if time itself had slowed down to match the steady pace of the building. That morning the television in the lounge was playing quietly while a few residents watched the midday news. I was not paying much attention at first. The announcer spoke about weather patterns and traffic reports, things that seemed far away from the life inside Greenwood. Then the anchor mentioned the state lottery drawing from the night before. The number flashed across the bottom of the screen along with the location where the winning ticket had been sold. Cedar Market. For a moment, the name barely registered in my mind. Then something shifted. I remembered the small store with the faded blue sign and the young clerk behind the counter. My fingers tightened slightly around the armrest of the chair. Eleanor noticed the movement and glanced toward me with quiet curiosity. I excused myself politely and walked back down the hallway toward my room, my steps slower than usual as the memory returned piece by piece. The ticket was still in the drawer beside my bed where I had placed it days earlier without a second thought. I opened the drawer carefully and unfolded the thin slip of paper. The numbers looked ordinary enough printed in black ink across the white background. I sat down on the edge of the bed and listened as the distant sound of the television echoed faintly through the corridor. My heart was steady, but my thoughts felt strangely light, as if I were about to open a letter whose contents I could not quite imagine. One by one, I compared the numbers on the ticket with the numbers I had just seen on the screen in the lounge. The first matched, then the second. I paused after the third number, convinced for a moment that I had misread something. Yet the sequence continued to align with quiet precision, each number falling into place like a key turning inside a lock. When the final number matched as well, the room around me seemed to grow very still. I did not jump up or shout or rush back into the hallway. Instead, I simply sat there holding the ticket between my fingers, listening to the gentle hum of the air conditioner above the door. The realization arrived slowly but with unmistakable clarity. The small piece of paper I had purchased during a quiet walk beyond the garden was worth more money than I had ever imagined possessing in a single lifetime. Somewhere in another part of the building, the television announcer was probably still discussing the lucky winner from Cedar Market. But inside my room, the moment felt private and strangely peaceful, as if the world had handed me an unexpected secret and trusted me to decide what to do with it. I did not tell anyone that afternoon. Not Eleanor. Not the nurses. Not even the quiet television in the lounge that had unknowingly delivered the news to me. I folded the ticket again and placed it back inside the drawer beside my bed, the same place where it had rested unnoticed for nearly a week. The room looked exactly the same as it had a few minutes earlier. The narrow bed, the wooden dresser, the window overlooking the parking lot. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I sat by the window for a long time watching the afternoon unfold outside. A white sedan pulled into the lot, and a man stepped out to help his mother from the passenger seat. A nurse carried a small box of supplies across the sidewalk toward the entrance. Life moved forward in quiet, ordinary ways, unaware that the course of my own life had just shifted in a direction I could never have predicted. By evening, I joined the others in the dining room as usual. Eleanor was already seated at our table, carefully spreading butter across a dinner roll while telling another resident about the garden roses beginning to bloom. She looked up when I sat down and studied my face for a moment. Eleanor had the kind of eyes that notice things most people missed. I wondered if she could sense that something inside me had changed. If she did, she said nothing. Dinner passed with the same gentle rhythm as every other evening. Plates clinked softly against the table. Someone laughed at a joke from across the room. I listened, spoke when spoken to, and allowed the calm routine of the place to continue uninterrupted. Yet behind that calm another thought had begun to grow quietly in my mind. I understood very clearly that the money represented more than comfort or security. It represented freedom. For the first time since Daniel left me at Greenwood, I realized that the future no longer depended on anyone else's decisions. Later that night, I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed again, the drawer slightly open beside me. The ticket lay inside exactly where I had left it, a thin rectangle of paper that now carried a weight far greater than its size suggested. I thought about Daniel and Ashley, about the careful conversations that had led me here, about the silence that had followed my arrival. A week had passed, and still there had been no phone call. No message asking how I was adjusting or whether I needed anything. That silence no longer felt painful. Instead, it felt informative. It told me everything I needed to know about the place I now occupied in their lives. I closed the drawer gently and walked back to the window. Outside, the parking lot lights glowed against the dark pavement, and the maple trees moved slowly in the evening breeze. Somewhere beyond those trees, the house where I once lived still stood on its quiet street. Perhaps Daniel believed the story had already reached its final chapter. Perhaps he thought the difficult decision had been made and life would simply continue from there. Standing by that window, watching the branches shift softly under the streetlights, I understood something that brought a small, steady calm to my thoughts. The story was not over at all. In fact, it had only just begun to take a turn that none of them could possibly imagine. I waited 3 more days before doing anything with the ticket. During that time, I followed the same quiet routine that had already begun shaping my life inside Greenwood Nursing Home. Breakfast at 7:30. Coffee in the lounge with Eleanor. A slow walk through the garden when the afternoon sun warmed the wooden bench near the roses. Nothing about my behavior changed on the outside, yet my thoughts had become clearer than they had been in years. On the 4th morning, I asked the front desk to help me arrange a meeting with an attorney who handled financial matters for residents. The staff member recommended a man named Harold Klein, whose office was only 15 minutes away in the nearby town. 2 days later, a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot, and a tall man in a navy suit stepped through the glass doors carrying a leather briefcase. We met in a quiet office near the reception desk. Mr. Klein listened carefully while I explained how I had purchased a lottery ticket during a walk to Cedar Market and how the numbers appeared to match the winning draw from the state lottery. He examined the ticket under the soft light of his desk lamp and then looked up at me with an expression that was both surprised and respectful. He explained that the prize would need to be verified through official channels, but that the value would likely be many millions of dollars. I nodded calmly as he spoke. The number itself mattered far less to me than the opportunity it created. Over the next hour, we discussed what could be done with such a fortune. Mr. Klein mentioned investments, property, and private trusts, but I already knew the direction my thoughts had taken. Greenwood Nursing Home had shown me something important during the past week. Many of the residents here had stories that sounded uncomfortably familiar. Children who visited less often each year. Families who slowly decided that distance was easier than responsibility. I told Mr. Klein that I wanted to create a charitable foundation dedicated to improving places like Greenwood. Better gardens. More comfortable rooms. Scholarships for caregivers who truly cared about the people they served. He wrote down each idea carefully while nodding in quiet agreement. Only once did he ask about my family. Specifically, he asked whether my son should be included in any of the legal arrangements that would follow. I looked through the office window toward the parking lot where the maple trees stood quietly along the edge of the road. For several seconds, I simply watched the leaves move in the wind before answering. I told him that my son had already made his own decision about where I belonged. Now it was my turn to decide what belonged to me. When the meeting ended, Mr. Klein placed the ticket safely inside a protective envelope and assured me that the claim process would begin immediately. As his car disappeared down the driveway, I walked slowly back through the hallway toward my room. Eleanor was waiting on the bench in the garden when I stepped outside again. She looked at me with the same calm curiosity she always carried and asked if everything had gone well. I smiled softly and sat beside her in the warm afternoon sunlight. For the first time since arriving at Greenwood, I felt something that had been absent for many years. Not anger, not revenge, simply control. The story that Daniel believed had ended the moment he left those suitcases beside my bed had quietly taken a different path. And somewhere beyond the maple trees a future was beginning to open that would no longer depend on anyone else's permission.